Imagine waking up each day, not wondering what to wear or eat, but whether you'll even survive. The world around you is a frozen wasteland, ruled by cold and prowled by beasts with dagger teeth. No houses, no heat, no safety, only ice, wind, and fear. This was daily life for our ancestors during the last ice age. How did they endure such brutal odds? And what ancient instincts still live quietly inside us today? Let's dive into a story written in frost and fire. Nobody expected the world to freeze. In the vast stretches of green valleys and thick woodlands, life had thrived for countless generations under a sun that felt almost eternal. Seasons had always come and gone with a gentle hand. Rains would nourish, warm winds would caress, and snow, when it appeared, would linger only briefly, more a playful visitor than a harbinger of despair. But then something began to shift, subtly at first, so discreet that even the most watchful eyes paid it no mind. It started with colder mornings. The dew on the grasses turned to fragile crystals that cracked under bare feet. The rivers that once carried sweet water from the highlands slowed, whispering under a delicate skin of ice. Birds that should have been singing grew quiet. The days seemed shorter, the nights unnervingly long, stretching on and on, their darkness creeping deeper into the hearts of all living things. Plants, usually quick to rebirth, hesitated. Small animals vanished into their burrows, not to be seen again for seasons. The change was slow enough to disguise its true ferocity, but persistent enough to demand uneasy questions. What if the sun was abandoning them? What if the warmth that nurtured all creatures had decided to turn its face away? People, scattered bands, who wandered from grove to grove, from rocky hill to gentle meadow, first noticed that their simple fires no longer offered comfort. Flames burned bright, yes, but the cold seemed to seep right through the skin, into the bones, nesting there like a cunning spirit that refused to leave. Elderly members of the clans found it harder to rise each morning, their joints stiff with a chill that no amount of rubbing could chase away. Children who once ran barefoot with wild delight now huddled close to their mothers, eyes wide open with confusion, not understanding why the air itself had grown so cruel. By the time the true grip of ice descended, the forests stood silent and empty. Trees that had swayed gracefully under gentle winds groaned under heavy burdens of snow. Lakes and streams became opaque mirrors, concealing dark secrets below. Even the wind changed its voice, no longer a soft sigh, but a thin, shrieking lament that swept through valleys and over ridges, clawing at everything in its path. The beasts of the land, mighty and small, were just as bewildered. Herds that had grazed in peaceful abundance now wandered aimlessly, driven by some instinct to flee, though they hardly knew where safety lay. Great shaggy creatures with curved tusks, who would later be known as mammoths, trudged in silent processions, their breaths rising like ghostly banners into the frozen air. Predators grew bolder, hungrier. The scarcity of prey turned every hunt into a desperate gamble. Eyes glowed from the tree line, watching, waiting for weakness. Within this tightening vise of ice, early humans found themselves standing at the threshold of oblivion. Their lives had always been precarious, balanced on the slender edge between nourishment and hunger, shelter and exposure. But this was something new, something vast and merciless. A cold that seemed almost alive in its determination to squeeze the breath out of every living chest. Nights became gatherings of dread. Whole families clustered around fragile flames, feeding them with twigs, brush, anything that would burn. They shared meager scraps of dried meat, whispering among themselves with hollow voices. Their eyes darted to the entrances of caves or crude shelters, half expecting the cold itself to come slithering in. Sleep was fitful. Dreams were haunted by visions of endless white expanses where no footsteps could be trusted, and by sounds, distant howls, crackling ice, or sometimes nothing at all, which was somehow worse. Still, even in the depths of this new, terrifying reality, something in them refused to surrender. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was that quiet, unspoken thread that connects all who breathe, the instinct to persist, to fight another day no matter the odds. Hands that trembled from the cold still reached for tools. Voices still rose in cautious encouragement. And every morning, no matter how bitter the night had been, they stepped outside, blinking into a world growing ever paler, ever harder. But how did they manage to keep going when so many other creatures simply laid down in the snow and never rose again? What fragile strategies, what unspoken agreements, what hidden strengths allowed these small, vulnerable beings to carve out a chance in a landscape that seemed to erase them? In the face of creeping glaciers, prowling beasts, and an air so sharp it felt like tiny knives against the lungs, how did the first humans hold on to life? And why did they believe it was worth it? Perhaps the answer lies not just in their clever hands or watchful eyes, but in the shared beat of hearts gathered close together, the quiet promises made in the dark to stay alive for each other, no matter what. And so begins the true unfolding of their story, the remarkable tale of how, against every cruel probability, they found ways to survive the age of endless winter. They had always known fear. It lurked in the rustle of underbrush when something unseen crept close, in the gleam of eyes reflecting firelight at the edge of camp, in the sudden hush of birds that might warn of a prowling cat. Fear was a teacher. It taught them where not to step, when to flee, how to hide. But none of those ancient lessons had prepared them for the terror that came with the snow. At first, it seemed almost gentle, soft flakes drifting down in lazy spirals, landing on hair and shoulders like tiny, playful spirits. Children reached out laughing, trying to catch them on their tongues. Even seasoned hunters paused to marvel at the transformation of the familiar world into a quiet dreamscape. For a heartbeat, it felt almost like a gift. But soon, they noticed how sound changed in this whiteness. The usual crackle of twigs, the distant murmur of streams, the warning snaps of branches under the weight of passing beasts, all muffled, swallowed by the snow. It was as if the world had been smothered under a heavy blanket, silencing every vital clue that told them where danger lurked. The forests grew still and ghostly. Nothing moved, nothing warned. In such silence, anything could be watching. The fear deepened when they tried to walk. Feet sank into softness that was treacherous beneath. Sharp rocks hidden, sudden holes where legs plunged down, twisting ankles. The ground they trusted was gone. Worse, snow-covered tracks.
They could no longer follow the prints of prey or read the subtle messages left by passing herds. And it hid the marks of predators too, until it was too late. The ice was crueler still. Where snow seemed soft, the ice was brutally hard, biting through crude footwear, numbing toes, and seeping pain upward into the very bones. Rivers that had always offered water and fish turned into solid glass. Lakes that once reflected the sky now trapped it beneath a cold lid. Early humans stood at the edges, staring into those flat, dead surfaces, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. For the ice seemed to them a sort of final seal, a sign that the earth itself was dying, that life was being locked away forever. And the whiteness, it stretched on and on, blinding, erasing landmarks. The comforting shapes of familiar hills and trees vanished under drifts, becoming strange, untrustworthy mounds. Hunters set out to check snares or scout trails and did not return, lost in a featureless waste that turned them around until they walked in circles, leaving faint tracks soon buried by new snow. Stories began to circulate around night fires, tales of spirits that lived in the snowfields, whispering to travelers, luring them away from safety. Of beasts perfectly disguised in white, so silent you never saw them until jaws closed around your throat. Of shadows that fell across the snow when no sun shone, leaving men to clutch their weapons and scan the emptiness, hearts racing. Gradually, their dread coalesced into something sharper, the realization that this was not a passing hardship, but a new order of the world. The old rhythms had broken. Food was harder to find, old hunting grounds empty or unreachable. Nights felt endless, cold creeping through every barrier they raised. Faces that had laughed by the fire grew gaunt, eyes hollow with hunger, and something worse, the fear that soon even courage would fail. And so they began to think differently. Survival was no longer about avoiding the quick strike of a leopard's claw or the snap of a hungry wolf. It was about enduring an entire landscape that seemed determined to erase them. They looked at the snow not as a fleeting visitor, but as a conquering power. In quiet, urgent voices, they spoke of needing new ways to live. They would have to learn to move with the whiteness, to read the silence instead of sounds, to respect the cold as much as they feared it. Because if they could not, if they clung only to what they had always known, then the white void would swallow them completely, leaving no trace they had ever lived at all. At first, they resisted. They clung stubbornly to the places that had sheltered them for generations. The valleys where game had always been plentiful, the familiar bends of rivers where fish swarmed in warmer times, the clusters of trees that broke the wind and offered quiet corners to build fires. These were more than just landscapes to them. They were woven into their very sense of belonging. The rocks had names, the old trails held memories. To abandon these places was to sever a deep and invisible bond. At first, they resisted. They clung stubbornly to the places that had sheltered them for generations. The valleys where game had always been plentiful, the familiar bends of rivers where fish swarmed in warmer times, the clusters of trees that broke the wind and offered quiet corners to build fires. These were more than just landscapes to them. They were woven into their very sense of belonging. The rocks had names, the old trails held memories. To abandon these places was to sever a deep and invisible bond.
But the cold was relentless. It pushed into every hollow, crept beneath every hide and woven mat. Animals moved on, following instincts older than any spoken word, and people found themselves with empty traps, snares left unsprung, tracks that vanished over the next ridge and never returned. Slowly, the fires grew smaller. Bellies tightened with ache. Children whimpered in their sleep. So came the hard decisions. Elders, voices heavy with the weight of lost worlds, gathered around the flickering light of evening flames and spoke of leaving. They debated long into the dark, weighing dangers. Was it better to brave the unknown or stay and surely perish? Some argued that the spirits of their ancestors would be angry if they abandoned sacred grounds. Others countered that the spirits would rather see them alive, wherever that might be. In the end, survival left little room for hesitation. They packed up what they could carry: bundles of dried meat, carefully wrapped embers cradled in moss and bark, treasured bone tools passed down through generations. Infants were strapped to mothers' backs, the old supported by staffs and the sturdy shoulders of the young, and they began to walk. The distances they covered seem almost impossible to us now. Across plains that offered no shelter, over rivers frozen in dangerous, shifting plates that moaned and cracked beneath their weight, through forests so heavy with snow that branches hung low like pleading arms, up hills where every breath was a struggle against thin, icy air, and down into valleys where bitter winds howled like angry beasts. Sometimes they would stop for days, hoping to find enough food or to wait out storms that swept across the land in blinding white fury. But always the cold would find them again, gnawing at fingers and feet, urging them onward. They learned to read subtle signs, the way moss grew on rocks, how the stars wheeled overhead, the scent of water on the wind. Even in exhaustion, some primal map guided them. They followed rumors carried by other wandering bands, stories of lands farther south or west where the sun still lingered longer in the sky, where grass might yet poke through thinning snow. Each telling grew more hopeful, more desperate, embroidered with half-dreamed visions of warmth. Perhaps they didn't believe these tales fully, but they believed in the need to try. For if there was any place left where a man could wake without ice forming in his beard by morning, they would risk everything to find it. Along the way, some were lost. Weak from hunger or illness, they simply lay down and could not rise again. Others disappeared during sudden squalls, their cries swallowed by the wind. But still the bands pressed on, driven by a stubborn flicker of hope that somewhere beyond the next ridge there would be less snow, more life, a chance to start again. In these long migrations, bonds of family and tribe grew even stronger. They leaned on one another, not just for survival, but for the quiet reassurance that they were not alone in this vast, indifferent wilderness. Side by side, step by weary step, they carried their shared longing for a sunlit world that seemed always just out of reach. A world where breath no longer curled in freezing clouds, where children could run without fear of vanishing into drifts taller than themselves, where once again they might simply live. In the time before the Great Cold, fire had been a welcome companion, useful, comforting, something to keep the dark at bay and roast fresh meat. They gathered it from lightning-scorched trees or coaxed it with painstaking friction, treating it as one of many tools in their simple arsenal. But as the ice advanced and nights stretched on forever, fire ceased to be merely helpful. It became sacred.
There was no clearer sign of this transformation than the way they began to speak of flames. Words once spoken with casual familiarity turned hushed and reverent. Around night circles, old voices wove stories that painted fire as a living being, a spirit of warmth and light who chose whether to bless or abandon them. They sang low chants while feeding it wood, whispered thanks when it caught and grew strong. The flames seemed to listen, dancing higher in reply. They grew meticulous, almost obsessive about tending to it. Someone always kept watch, even in the deepest hours when sleep called most sweetly. If eyes drooped and heads nodded, the memory of those who had frozen in the dark snapped them back awake. They cradled embers in nests of dry bark and moss, bundled tightly to preserve the smolder, so that when they moved camp, they could breathe life back into it without risking the gamble of striking new sparks in the biting wind. A single coal could mean the difference between survival and a slow, creeping end in silence and cold.
Their fires became more elaborate. Instead of careless piles of branches, they constructed clever frameworks, logs arranged so snow and wind could not smother the heart of the blaze, stones encircling the base to trap heat and reflect it inward. Some built partial shelters of wood and hide over their fires, venting just enough for smoke to escape, ensuring the precious flames stayed shielded. They learned to mix different kinds of wood, softer for quick ignition, harder for long, steady burn, and how to stack them so they would last through the longest watches. Children were taught from the earliest days how to feed and respect the fire. Little hands practiced placing twigs just so, learning which sticks snapped dry and which bent damp and useless. A mistake, a sudden dump of snow, a careless stomp, could earn not only harsh words but tears of genuine terror, for the loss of fire meant far more than discomfort. It meant opening the door to the frozen death that waited patiently outside every shelter. In whispered tales by the glow of coals, fire took on godlike traits. Some said it had come from the belly of the earth itself, given to them out of pity. Others believed it was a fragment of the sun, fallen to live among them, guiding them through a time when the real sun seemed to have abandoned its duties. They made small offerings, scraps of dried fat, curls of bark scented with resin, casting them into the heart of the flames and watching the sparks leap up in acceptance. So it was that fire became more than light and heat. It was a bond between them and the mysteries of the world, a fragile covenant that, if honored, would stand guard against the cold's merciless reach. In every crackle and swirl of orange, they saw a promise that so long as these small gods danced for them, they would endure another night, dream of spring again, and rise to face whatever bitter winds tomorrow might bring. When the creeping cold began to swallow the land, caves became coveted sanctuaries. Their stone bellies offered natural protection from the wind and a sturdy place to anchor fires. But caves were few and often already occupied by other desperate bands or by beasts whose claws and teeth claimed the darkness long before humans arrived. Faced with this brutal shortage, people turned to something new. They began to build. It started simply. They gathered long branches and leaned them together in circles or rough cones, tying the tops with sinew or rawhide, layering leaves and grasses in thick mats across the ribs. Over this, they stretched heavy skins from bison or deer, sometimes even piecing together dozens of smaller furs into patchwork cloaks for their shelters. The result was a kind of squat tent that broke the cruel bite of the wind. Inside, heat from a small fire,
or even their huddled bodies alone, could raise the temperature enough to hold back frost's creeping fingers. But necessity drove ingenuity ever onward. Where great beasts like mammoths still roamed and fell to skillful hunts, their immense curved tusks and heavy leg bones were salvaged and erected into frameworks. These supported not mere lean-tos, but striking domes, strong enough to withstand winter's weighty snows. Across these skeletal arches, people layered hides and piled sod, sealing gaps with mud or icy slurry that hardened into a protective crust. In time, some of these mammoth bone lodges became true marvels, warm, enduring refuges that could cradle an entire extended family through the worst months. Grasses and reeds, gathered in the brief warm seasons and stored carefully, were also pressed into service. Bundled tightly, they became insulating panels stuffed into the walls, or thick mats laid on floors to keep skin from direct contact with frozen ground. Some groups even devised low sleeping benches of packed earth or wood, raising bodies just high enough to avoid the deepest chill. They paid close attention to entrances. Openings faced away from prevailing winds, sometimes covered by heavy flaps of hide that could be dropped at night or during storms. Narrow crawlways forced cold air to slow and swirl before it could reach the main chamber. Stones ringed fires not only to trap sparks, but to absorb and then slowly release precious heat. These structures were more than shelters. They were triumphs of fragile, determined minds over a world that seemed eager to snuff them out. Inside, amid the scent of smoke and hides, life continued. Children played with small carved toys. Elders murmured stories that layered memory upon memory. Couples whispered plans for hunts or simply lay close, sharing warmth. Without these first true architectures, countless lives would have winked out in the long black of winter. In every lash of wind that failed to penetrate their walls, in every dawn when families woke with breath still rising and hearts still beating, there was a quiet victory. It was the start of something monumental, the first human claim that even if nature stretched out vast and merciless, they could still carve out corners of it to call their own.
Hunting had always been dangerous, a delicate dance between predator and prey that could turn fatal with a single misstep. But in the crushing cold of the Ice Age, the very rules of the hunt transformed into something far more brutal, a gamble where the stakes were not just the evening's meal, but the survival of entire families. Game was scarcer now. Herds migrated along new, unpredictable paths, driven by forces beyond human reckoning. Grasslands vanished under sheets of snow, and beasts followed the promise of distant, hidden pastures. Hunters, once confident in the habits of deer and boar, found themselves tracking creatures into foreign, treacherous territories, where the cold itself seemed to watch, waiting to claim the unprepared. So they adapted. They began to target the great shaggy titans of their world, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, massive bison, animals that offered unimaginable wealth in meat, fat, hides, and bones, if only they could be brought down. But such hunts were perilous beyond any they had faced before. A misjudged spear throw, a startled trumpeting charge, and entire hunting parties could be trampled under tons of panicked muscle. To tip the odds, they grew cunning. They learned to read the lay of the land like a silent language, choosing narrow passes or icy gullies where giant beasts could be trapped, funneled, slowed by deep snow or slick ice. They dug pits, cleverly masked with branches and frost-dusted leaves, lined with sharpened stakes that waited unseen until a heavy foot broke through. Along ridges and cliffs, they sometimes risked driving herds towards sudden drop-offs, hoping panic would do what their spears could not. Smaller prey required no less ingenuity. Snares of twisted sinew were strung between trees, designed to cinch tight around the legs or necks of fleet-footed hares. Deadfalls balanced heavy stones above tempting bait, waited for unsuspecting scavengers. Even simple fences of piled brush could guide animals toward hidden hunters waiting with readied spears. But every step into the wilderness carried its own dangers. Snow concealed cracks in the ice where rivers still ran swift and deep beneath fragile shells, ready to swallow a man without trace. Predator tracks often led to grim surprises. Saber-toothed cats crouched in wait, or packs of dire wolves whose hungry eyes gleamed with a disturbing intelligence. In these encounters, humans were as much the hunted as the hunter, forced to retreat or fight desperately for their lives.
The cold itself was an adversary more patient and deadly than any beast. Long hours spent stalking prey meant breath freezing into painful crystals in nostrils, fingers losing sensation, muscles growing sluggish. A man could slip into exhaustion so profound he might simply sit to rest for a moment, only to never rise again. Still, they ventured out day after day, because the alternative was slow starvation in their carefully constructed shelters. Every successful kill was celebrated with fierce relief, not just for the full bellies it promised, but for the precious fat that could be rendered for lamps, the hides that would become warm clothing, the bones that might shape new spear points. Each hunt was a fight against oblivion, a grim wager placed against nature itself. And in this harsh crucible, they honed skills and strategies that would echo down through countless generations. The first sophisticated tactics, the first lessons in patience and planning, the first recognition that to outwit a world intent on swallowing them, they would need not just strength, but cleverness, unity, and a quiet, relentless courage. The cold did more than freeze rivers and chase herds from familiar valleys. It reached into the very fabric of human lives, reshaping bonds and stirring a quiet revolution in how people understood one another. Before the great ice tightened its grip, families often roamed in small, loosely connected bands, bound by blood and a handful of old loyalties. But when the winters deepened and the nights seemed to stretch on forever, they discovered that such small groups could no longer stand alone. It began out of necessity. A single family huddled by its lonely fire was too vulnerable. If sickness struck or if a hunt failed, there were no extra hands to share food, no neighboring voices to lend comfort. Wolves watched the dark edges of the clearing with knowing eyes. And so, little by little, kin called out to kin. Cousins, distant uncles, old rivals once divided by grudges. They set those quarrels aside and gathered under one smoke-stained roof or in neighboring shelters linked by narrow, trodden paths. Soon, these gatherings swelled beyond mere family ties. Neighboring bands, pushed by the same hunger and terror, began to join forces. A man might find himself hunting alongside someone whose name he had barely known a season before, sharing dried meat with strangers who became brothers by the simple law of shared hardship. With these growing clusters came new rules. Old instincts of competition had to bend, for one reckless fight over food could tear the fragile unity apart. Elders' words gained fresh weight. Their long memories of disputes and reconciliations, of good seasons and bad, became the bedrock on which they built careful agreements. Fires were shared by multiple hearth circles, with a watch always set, not just for prowling beasts, but to ensure fairness.
that no one family took more than its share of roasted marrow or fresh hide. They also forged rituals to knit these bigger communities together. Communal feasts after successful hunts, even if meager, turned into solemn moments of gratitude and reaffirmed trust. Simple ceremonies, a chant offered to the fire, a mark drawn in ash across foreheads, reminded all present that survival was now a shared burden. If a child fell ill, several mothers tended to them. If a hunter was wounded, many hands helped him back to the shelter. Many voices murmured encouragement. And something profound changed in their hearts. No longer did people think only of their narrow circle of immediate kin. They began to see themselves as part of a larger we, a living web where each person's fate was bound to many others. This deeper sense of belonging offered more than protection from wolves and cold. It brought a kind of emotional warmth, a fragile but real comfort that made those endless winters slightly more bearable. This was the quiet beginning of what would echo through human history as tribes, clans, entire cultures. It was in these icebound gatherings that they first learned to temper individual wants for the sake of the group, to create customs and spoken laws, to respect voices that called for patience or unity when fear threatened to tear them apart. Long after the ice began to retreat, those bonds held fast. They became the very marrow of human society, a lesson written not in gentle seasons, but carved in frost and kept alive by breath shared in dark, bitter nights. If the Ice Age tested anything, it was the tender thread of life carried in the small, fragile bodies of children. In these tiny forms lay not just hope, but the fierce determination of an entire people to continue, to refuse extinction. That made their care a quiet, sacred duty shared by all. Mothers wrapped infants in layer upon layer of soft furs, weaving grasses or dried moss between the pelts to trap warmth even closer. They made snug little cocoons, sometimes binding the swaddles with thin strips of hide so no cold breath could slip inside. At night, babies were pressed tightly against bare skin, sharing their mother's heat under heavy communal blankets of animal skins, so close that each heartbeat became a lullaby. Fathers took just as active a role. In the long hours of darkness, they cradled tiny bodies against their chests, whispering low songs that were less for soothing than for teaching calm, because silence could mean the difference between life and death. Children were gently trained almost from birth not to wail without cause. They were rocked and hushed at the first sign of distress, hands covering little mouths in a tender, desperate plea to keep quiet. Older siblings played their part, draping arms protectively over babies, breathing warm air into small faces red from the cold. Ingenious tricks helped shield the smallest from biting air. Some families crafted hollow spaces lined with hot stones near the fire, covering them with furs so infants could nestle in these makeshift warm dens. Others tucked coals inside flat clay bowls, carefully insulated so they wouldn't burn, then slid them beneath bedding to create gentle, radiant heat through the night. But more than cleverness, it was the all-consuming vigilance that kept children alive. A cough in the night brought immediate concern. A baby's skin checked again and again for signs of chill. Even during scarce hunts, adults returned with morsels set aside for the youngest mouths, knowing the entire future of the clan depended on these small stomachs staying filled. Danger also wore other faces. A crying infant could draw hungry predators lurking beyond the reach of firelight. So lullabies took on a hushed urgency, almost prayers breathed into little ears. When an older child fussed, elders would scoop them up, pacing back and forth across the shelter, humming low notes that vibrated right into their tiny ribs, settling them back into stillness. Through it all, there was something heartbreakingly determined in the way men and women alike shielded these vulnerable lives. In every extra pelt wrapped around a shivering toddler, every carefully chewed strip of meat offered to a wide-eyed child before anyone else, there was an unspoken promise that somehow, no matter how savage the cold, they would protect this fragile spark. Because in these children laid not just tomorrow's hunters and gatherers, but living proof that humanity would not be erased. That the great ice might stretch its fingers far, but it would not snuff out the last warm breath of their kind.
In the age when breath turned instantly to frost, and the sun itself seemed to falter in the sky, survival hinged on more than shelter and fire. It demanded a new skin altogether, one crafted by human hands to stand against a world bent on freezing them where they stood. Thus was born the first true clothing, not just draped hides to ward off rain, but carefully fashioned, layered, ingeniously adapted armor against the cold. It likely began with simple wrapping. Early people took fresh pelts, still supple with natural oils, and tied them around shoulders and waists. But as the cold deepened, they discovered that loose coverings did little to stop icy wind from slithering underneath. So they began to stitch, using bone needles honed to delicate points and sinew drawn from the very animals they hunted. They threaded pieces of hide together, shaping them to curve around elbows and knees, to overlap at the chest, to cinch snug at wrists and ankles. From these first crude tunics and leggings evolved more sophisticated garments. Entire suits were fashioned from thick pelts, fur turned inward to trap precious body heat, rough hide turned outward to resist snow and sleet. In the coldest regions, people developed something akin to full-body coveralls, combining multiple layers so that no patch of bare skin tempted the cold. They devised boots of staggering ingenuity for their time, soft inner moccasins of dry grass or rabbit fur that wicked moisture away, covered by outer shells of tougher hide, sometimes stuffed again with moss. These boots reached high on the calves, laced tightly with rawhide strips to keep out drifting snow. For hands they crafted mittens of fur, sometimes with an extra layer tied over the back of the hand where the wind struck hardest. Differences blossomed depending on where people roamed. In the far northern bands, where snow lay year-round, and hunting the great beasts was the core of survival, clothing grew bulky but marvelously effective, layer upon layer, sometimes double furs, with elaborate hoods edged in soft, downy feathers to guard the tender skin of the face. Further south, where winter still bit hard but retreated in cycles, people favored lighter wraps, single-thickness tunics, sleeveless cloaks thrown over shoulders, allowing them to adjust as the day warmed or cooled.
Adornment, too, was not forgotten, even in such times of hardship. Along the seams, some stitched tiny bits of bone or beads carved from ivory, symbols of clans, of stories, of a quiet pride that even under threat of extinction, beauty and meaning still mattered. Children's coats often bore little charms meant to ward off sickness or lure the favor of whatever spirits might watch from the forests. What these innovations achieved cannot be overstated. Warm clothing was not simply convenience. It rewrote the map of where humans could live. It let them linger in hunting grounds others abandoned, follow game into deeper snows, stand watch longer at the edge of dark forests. Each stitch pulled through hide was a quiet rebellion against the ice, a declaration that no matter how far the glaciers crept, humanity would not go naked into that dark, unforgiving night. And so, with needles of bone and threads of sinew, they quite literally sewed their destiny into place, crafting a second skin that let them stride into realms once ruled only by beasts adapted by countless ages to the cold. Through these humble garments, they changed the course of their own story, one careful stitch at a time. Under the cruel hand of the advancing ice, the world that once seemed vast and generous shrank into a patchwork of desperate islands of survival. Forests receded, meadows disappeared beneath drifts that lingered all year, and rivers slowed under hard lids of glass. What remained were narrow belts of relative abundance, valleys sheltered from the worst winds, caves with dry, high ceilings and wide ledges to store food, stretches of river that still ran free enough to provide fish. Such places became prizes beyond measure, coveted not only by the men and women who already depended on them, but by countless others driven by the same hunger, the same primal fear of the long dark. At first, conflict was sporadic. Small bands crossing paths might try to avoid one another, wary of bloodshed that could cripple both sides. But as seasons piled upon seasons of cold, caution eroded under the press of empty bellies and the sight of children growing thin and listless. Where once strangers might have shared a cautious greeting or even traded bits of meat for flint flakes, now their eyes darted to weapons first, hands tightening on spear shafts, every muscle braced for a sudden rush. The spark of violence often needed little. A single snare line tripped by unfamiliar feet. The carcass of a downed stag found already claimed by others who stood over it with blood still wet on their knives. A campfire glimpsed in the distance, its glow a tantalizing promise of heat and food that some would dare to take by force. Arguments shouted across snowy clearings ended not in compromise, but in sharpened flints slicing through air, the shriek of pain lost quickly to the hungry wind. Thus were born the first true territorial feuds, more than passing skirmishes, more than the solitary ambushes of old. Entire groups took to guarding their hunting paths and trapping grounds with the vigilance of wolves defending a den. Watchers were posted on rocky outcrops to scan for intruders. Signals were devised, calls that echoed strangely through icy woods, or stacked stones that spelled warnings few dared ignore. Some went so far as to mark boundaries with grisly trophies. Bones of hunted beasts or of defeated rivals hung from trees or planted upright in the snow, a silent declaration that this ground was claimed and would be defended. Pushed to these extremes by the cold, people began to innovate in darker directions. Weapons, once mostly tools for hunting, were now honed specifically for fighting humans. Short, thick clubs emerged, studded with sharp flakes of stone to tear as well as crush. Spears were balanced not just for long throws at distant game, but for quick jabs in close. The tips sometimes flaked along both edges to slice on withdrawal. Even the humble sling found new purpose. Its stones smoothed and weighted for deadly accuracy against upright rivals rather than fleeing hares. And along with these tools of harm came the slow birth of tactics. Small groups learned to move together in practiced silence, flanking opponents, driving them into ambushes. Fires were deliberately built in misleading locations to draw enemies away from real camps. Footprints were brushed out or false trails laid to confuse pursuers. In these cold crucibles, the raw seeds of organized conflict, and thus the foundations of future warfare, took root. None of this was abstract. Every clash left its scars on the survivors. Limbs shattered by clubs, deep punctures from flint blades that refused to heal cleanly. More haunting were the faces of children who saw brothers and fathers not return, who listened in the night to low voices recounting the day's bloody work, trying to justify it with the hard arithmetic of survival. Each tale carried an undertone of grief, for even victors lost much. Food that might have been freely traded once was now taken with blood, and every new feud demanded fresh vigilance, fresh losses. Yet, through this grim sharpening of human nature also came unexpected solidarity, a paradox born of relentless threat. Within each clan, unity tightened. Disputes that might have once divided families were set aside when the danger was not just from nature's claws, but from spear points wielded by other hands. The safety of every individual now depended on the group holding firm together, standing shoulder to shoulder when others tried to take what little they had left. Elders took on new gravity, not only as keepers of hunting knowledge, but as cautious counselors in the politics of these emerging small wars. When to defend with force, when to send gifts and words instead. Thus, under the cold sky, humanity was forged anew, not simply as isolated wanderers chasing game, but as defenders of shared lands and fragile hearths. The first crude maps were sketched not on bark or hide, but in living memory. Which hills belonged to which clan, which streams could be crossed without challenge, which caves were to be avoided unless one thirsted for trouble. Over generations, this wove the early threads of identity that stretched beyond mere family. People began to say, "Our valley, our hunting grounds," not merely "my fire." This was not the gentle blossoming of community some dream of when thinking of ancient days. It was a hard, often bloody lesson taught by ice and hunger, forcing people to see themselves as parts of something larger, precisely because only through numbers could they hope to protect what scraps of warmth and life remained. Even so, within that crucible lay the early forge of civilization itself. For without the pressure to guard territory and pool resources, humanity might never have learned to stand so firmly together, nor to imagine that some piece of earth could belong to them at all. And above every skirmish, every desperate night spent gripping weapons instead of sleeping, hovered the same silent truth. This violence was never born of greed alone. It was the tragic echo of a world grown too small, too cruel, pressing frail bodies to acts they would never have chosen had the land still been kind. In their harsh struggle for territory and precious shelter, they laid down not only trails of blood, but also the roots of future cities, future nations, lessons carved painfully into memory by the long, merciless winter. They learned quickly, or they died. In a world where the cold was not simply an inconvenience, but a cunning, relentless adversary, where beasts with long teeth and silent paws roamed as hungry as they were, the choice of where to sleep could mean the difference between rising to greet another day or never opening one's eyes again. Thus began their careful, almost instinctive search for hidden places to lay their heads, spots where neither the wind nor the waiting eyes of predators could easily reach them. It was not always so. Before the deep cold took hold of the land, people often slept in more open camps. They chose grassy hollows by rivers, small glades beneath friendly trees, trusting to the light of their fires and the watchful eyes of a few sentinels to keep dangers at bay. But under the cruel dominion of ice, when nights stretched unbearably long and the wind seemed to grow a mind of its own, creeping, clawing, sliding under hides and through hair, such openness became a death sentence. So they sought out secret places. They learned to favor narrow crevices in rock faces, where walls pressed close enough to block the wind's savage breath. Sometimes entire families wedged themselves together in these cramped corridors, shoulder to shoulder, knees to backs, sharing body heat in a living chain of fragile warmth. Children in such places might whimper from the press of elbows or the scratch of stone beneath them, but better a bruised hip than to wake rimed with frost. Pits were another refuge. They dug shallow depressions in the earth, lining them with grasses and furs, then huddled low. Over these pits, they built simple roofs from branches, sod, and snow itself, creating low domes that from a distance blended perfectly with the winter's drifts. To an unwary predator, these shelters were just more lumps in a white, endless sea, not hiding precious breathing life beneath. Inside, the small cavity trapped warmth surprisingly well. Breath steamed up, condensed, and sometimes froze along the ceiling in delicate crystal veils. Fragile art born of desperation. Snow, paradoxically, became a trusted ally. They learned its insulating power, how a thick layer could keep deadly winds out better than thin air ever could. They began to hollow shallow caves directly into drifts, sculpting small chambers that, while claustrophobic, stayed markedly warmer than the open air. With furs laid on the packed floor and an angled tunnel to block the direct path of gusts, these simple snow shelters could hold warmth like a secret. At night, families slept so tightly packed that they seemed a single creature, breaths mingling, small fires, or even just hot stones set near their feet to chase away the worst of the chill. Caves, of course, were treasures when found, not the grand yawning caverns of legend, but narrow cuts into hillsides, shallow bowls scooped by ancient water. The best caves faced away from the prevailing wind and had bends or side pockets where light and warmth could pool, hidden from prowling eyes outside. Smoke from their small fires often had no easy escape, collecting overhead in pungent, stinging clouds. But that was a burden they accepted gladly, for it meant the scent of their cooking, the soft sounds of their existence, did not drift far into the open to advertise a feast to wolves or worse. They also became masters of subtlety. Unlike in gentler climates where a high blaze might serve to show off strength or invite neighbors, in this icy world, fires were kept low and often screened behind rocks or small windbreaks. At night, they sometimes let the flames gutter nearly out, sleeping in the dark with only glowing embers. The soft red pulses gave just enough promise of light to soothe the human heart, but little enough to betray them across snowy plains. This constant seeking of hidden sleeping grounds bred caution deep into their marrow. Before settling in for the night, scouts padded quietly around the chosen spot, noses and eyes keen for spoor or tracks that might signal a predator's nearby lair. They listened for unnatural silences, the stillness that meant every other creature had already fled, wisely giving a hunting cat its solitary dominion. And even then, they rarely trusted a single hiding place for long, ready to break camp and slip away under starlight if uneasy murmurs passed through the group. So each dawn they rose, stiff, chilled, sometimes covered in a thin frost that had crept in despite every precaution, and lived another day because they had chosen obscurity over comfort. In these small, clever decisions lay the quiet heroism of their age,
a willingness to press into narrow cracks, to breathe stale, smoky air, to pile together like frightened pups, all for the sake of waking again. Over time, these hidden sanctuaries left marks on their stories and minds. Myths formed of the underworld, of safe hollows granted by benevolent spirits, of whispered agreements with the earth itself to shelter them just one more night. And when, in future millennia, people would build great halls and glowing cities, somewhere deep inside would linger the echo of these early nights spent in secret, when the only safety in a wide, ruthless world was found by crawling into the smallest, darkest spaces they could find, and holding each other close until morning finally came.
Hunger was a patient hunter, crueler even than the beasts with long fangs that stalked the edges of firelight. It moved invisibly through their bodies, hollowing cheeks, dimming eyes, tightening stomachs into hard, aching knots that woke them in the night. In that pitiless landscape where snow blanketed the earth for months without end, finding enough to eat was not a challenge met by simple luck or the occasional fortunate kill. It required cunning, endurance, and a willingness to consume things that would make many modern hearts shudder. The first rule was waste nothing. When a mammoth or a woolly rhinoceros fell, whether by carefully laid traps or by sheer miraculous fortune, it was as if the sky itself had opened and spilled life upon them. They stripped every shred of meat from bone, sliced fat into thick, greasy slabs, cracked open marrow to suck out its rich, buttery core. Even the hides, after serving their first duty as clothing or shelter, might later be stewed into a kind of gelatinous broth if things grew truly desperate. Fat was more precious than tender muscle. It burned slow in the body, provided warmth in a way lean meats never could. So they saved it jealously, rendering chunks of blubber in simple stone pots over low fires. This liquid gold was poured into hollowed-out horns or stomach casings, then sealed with snow and packed tight. Buried beneath drifts, it kept for weeks, sometimes even longer, ready to be chipped out and added to thin soups or chewed like bitter, greasy candles when no other food could be found. Meat, too, was stored in ways that took advantage of the very cold that threatened to kill them. Large haunches were buried deep in snow pits, insulated not only by frost, but by layers of pine boughs and packed earth to keep scavengers at bay. The freezing process slowed rot, preserving the flesh almost like a primitive ice locker. When it was retrieved, sliced into thin strips and smoked over coals, it filled the air with a heavy scent that might draw wide, hungry eyes from children clustered around the fires. But fresh kills were rare gifts, and the lean months stretched on relentlessly. So they learned to turn to other sources of sustenance that would surprise or even repel us today. They cracked open bones far too small for much marrow, sucking out even the tiniest traces of life-rich fat. They dug through snow to unearth roots that held stubborn energy, gnawing on tough fibers that stained lips brown and left grit between teeth. In places where small green plants still clung to life beneath drifts, they painstakingly pulled apart moss and lichen, learning which varieties added meager but vital nutrients to stews.
Winter was also the season of hidden caches. In autumn, they had carefully stored nuts and hard fruits in pits lined with leaves and bark, covered over to keep them dry. Finding one of these in the depths of February was like stumbling upon treasure, though often they were forced to share these troves with clever rodents who had found the stash first. Sometimes what remained was wormy or mold-spotted, but hunger stripped away disgust.
Anything that did not directly poison them became fair game. Not all their choices were safe, of course. Desperation led to experimentation, and some learned by painful trial that certain berries or bark brewed into tea would bring not relief, but cramping sickness or even death. Over generations, knowledge hardened into careful taboos, warnings repeated by elders around the fire about which bright red morsels were best left alone, which pungent mushrooms spelled only grief. Even insects and grubs found a place in their winter diet. Under rotting logs, where cold could not quite penetrate, larvae wriggled fat with stored energy. Children often did the delicate work of splitting bark to collect these tiny prizes, popping them into mouths with practiced ease. Such fare was not merely emergency food, it was recognized for what it was: dense, vital protein, a spark of survival hidden in unlikely places. Then there were truly desperate measures. Leather softened by long use, from straps, bags, even bits of old boots, might be boiled into a foul, oily broth. The result barely qualified as nourishment, but it could stave off the gnawing emptiness inside long enough to last until the next chance at meat or a cache of forgotten nuts was uncovered beneath the snow. Throughout all of this, they developed quiet rituals of gratitude. Even a thin handful of dried berries plucked from a hidden nook was shared, passed from hand to hand so that each tasted sweetness before the last crushed fruit vanished. A lucky marrowbone cracked open after days of scraping by on bitter roots was met with murmurs of thanks, not just to some vague spirits of nature, but to the memory of every hunt, every forager who had once taught them where to look. In these humble, often grim meals, they found a kind of communal resilience. They learned that survival did not always taste good. It was frequently bitter, stringy, or crawling with small legs. But it was survival nonetheless. Each mouthful was another defiance of winter's long, cold rain, another fragile promise that if they could endure just one more night, the world might yet turn warm again. And so they fed themselves not only on marrow and fat and roots, but on the stubborn hope that someday the snow would melt and the land would bloom once more. It seems almost a contradiction to us now. These people lived in conditions that would chill modern humans to the bone within minutes, breathing air so cold it stung the lungs, sleeping in shelters that never fully banished drafts. Yet the typical winter ailments we know so well, runny noses, hacking coughs, throats raw from infection, were strikingly rare among them. They did not shuffle about with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces or spend long nights awake with fevers that burned hotter than any campfire. The truth lay partly in their remarkable adaptation to cold and partly in the silent workings of the diseases themselves. Their bodies had become living instruments tuned to the icy orchestra of the Ice Age. From infancy, every breath they drew was a lesson in survival. Tiny blood vessels in their skin learned to constrict at the first kiss of frost, shunting warmth inward to vital organs. Their metabolisms blazed like hidden furnaces, burning fat stores at rates we would find astonishing, transforming every scrap of marrow and shred of dried meat into energy that kept core temperatures stable. Even at rest, their hearts beat with a slightly different cadence, trained across generations to pump blood efficiently in spite of the cold's constant siege. This did not mean they were immune to suffering. Frostbite took its toll on fingers and toes, sometimes more. Arthritis bloomed early in joints repeatedly exposed to freezing damp. But the viruses that today flourish in crowded winter homes and schools, hopping eagerly from sneeze to handshake to mouth, they found little purchase in these scattered, frost-hardened bands. In part, it was simple math. These early humans lived in small, loosely knit groups, rarely numbering more than a few dozen. When they did meet other bands, it was often brief and cautious, with wide spacing born of mutual suspicion or simple practicality. Such thin social networks meant that pathogens requiring frequent, close human contact struggled to survive. There were no cramped towns with walls to trap stale air, no bustling marketplaces packed with coughing strangers. A virus that managed to embed itself in one person might simply die out for lack of fresh hosts before it could become a true outbreak. Moreover, their open-air existence, harsh as it was, ironically protected them. Cold winds constantly scoured their surroundings, dispersing the microscopic droplets that today so easily circulate in closed rooms. They did not linger indoors with windows sealed tight against the chill. Their shelters breathed whether they wished it or not, leaks and gaps ensuring a steady exchange of air. In such circumstances, many respiratory viruses found it exceedingly difficult to spread. Yet they were not free from disease. Their threats came from other corners of nature's arsenal. Parasites, especially worms, picked up from undercooked meat or from dirty hands after gutting animals, sapped strength in slow, draining fashion. Infections from wounds were ever-present dangers. A scratch from a splintered spear or a cut from a flint blade could blossom into a festering sore that consumed muscle and even bone if luck and the crude treatments of the time failed. Their dental health tells further stories. Teeth worn down from grit embedded in tough, fibrous roots and meat sliced with sandy blades. Abscesses that could spread infection through the jaw and beyond. Some bones recovered thousands of years later show pitting and deformities that speak of bacterial invasions that modern antibiotics would have banished in days. Still, when it came to the colds and flus that fill modern winters with sniffles and misery, they were curiously untouched. This was not because the viruses didn't exist in some form, but because the ecosystem, both biological and social, in which they might thrive simply hadn't yet solidified. Many of the viral strains that plague us today evolved alongside the dense settlements of later agricultural societies. It was only when humans began crowding into villages, living cheek by jowl with domesticated animals, that the perfect conditions arose for these illnesses to refine their lethal talents. And so, paradoxically, these people who faced daily threats from starvation, from prowling cats with curved fangs, from nights cold enough to freeze breath solid, they did so without the constant backdrop of sneezes and sore throats that we accept as winter's price. Their bodies bore other scars, certainly, and their lives were shorter on average, claimed by hardships we can scarcely imagine. But in the hush of their snowy camps, where fire cracked and popped beneath the open sky, no chorus of coughs accompanied the night. In this one small way, the long grip of the ice spared them a misery that would come only later when humanity traded the wilderness for crowded hearths and bustling streets. Long before words were carved into stone, or stories were captured in painted scrolls, long before any priest stood before a temple altar, there was the trembling awe of men and women faced with forces they could neither predict nor command. In the heart of the Ice Age, this awe found its most urgent expression, not in worship of distant sun gods or sky spirits, but in desperate, whispered rituals aimed squarely at the biting cold that threatened to swallow everything they loved. It's not hard to imagine how it began. In the dark of endless nights, while winds howled outside their fragile shelters, people clung close to dying embers and sought meaning in the way flames twisted and spat. The crackle of burning wood sounded almost like voices. Shadows flung upon rock walls danced in shapes too strange, too deliberate to be purely random. And in that eerie interplay of light and dark, Of warmth and the endless cold pressing just beyond, arose the first fragile sparks of magic. At first, these were likely simple gestures born of instinct. A mother might press a charm, a small stone worn smooth by rivers, or a carved tooth from a long-hunted beast, into her child's hand with a murmured plea that it protect them through the night. Hunters bound knots in leather thongs before venturing out, not fully understanding why, only that it felt like tying hopes into something solid, carrying with them a little shield against misfortune. But as winters piled upon winters, such small acts grew into more elaborate customs. Some among them began to stand apart, men and women who seemed more attuned to the strange undercurrents of the world, who listened to the whisper of wind through cracked stone, or claimed to see shapes in drifting snow no one else could. These early shamans held no formal title, no special robes, yet others gradually deferred to them, drawn by their calm in the face of terrors that left ordinary hearts pounding. They became keepers of rituals, inventors of ceremonies designed to court favor with powers they imagined dwelled within the ice and wind. When a hunt failed too often, or a child sickened without clear cause, they would gather the clan around small fires and chant low, rhythmic phrases, swaying so that the entire group seemed to breathe together. They sprinkled ashes in deliberate patterns on the ground, or tossed special herbs and fat into the flames, watching how the smoke curled, reading omens in the way it struggled or danced. Bones, too, held mysteries. The knuckle bones of small animals were cast onto hides, the patterns they formed taken as messages from unseen spirits. Sometimes these readings decided where the next hunting foray would go, or whether it was time to abandon a failing camp entirely. It might sound like superstition, and perhaps it was, but it offered something priceless in that grim, uncertain age. A sense of agency, of connection to forces otherwise cold and uncaring. Winter itself became almost personified, an immense prowling being that could be placated, bargained with. Some groups created simple idols from twisted wood or stacked stones smeared with ochre, set a little way outside their shelters as offerings to the cold, hoping to distract its hunger. Others left scraps of meat or beads of polished bone at the mouths of caves, as though paying a toll so the darkness would pass them by. And always there was the yearning for a thaw. Even the most weathered hunter could be moved to tears by the fragile shoot of green seen too early in a season. It seemed a promise, a whisper that life had not been entirely banished from the world. So in the deepest months, when despair threatened to root in the breast like frostbite in flesh, shamans led hopeful rites aimed at coaxing back the warmth. They painted swirling lines on arms and faces, symbols meant to mimic the sun's journey or the melting of ice. They danced slow, circling steps that imitated rivers breaking free, ice flows cracking under returning light. Through such rituals, magic wove itself into the fabric of survival. It was not merely spiritual comfort, it shaped real decisions. A clan uncertain whether to risk a new migration might defer to a shaman's trance visions. A mother doubting if her weak infant could survive might wrap it in a skin marked with protective sigils, finding resolve she might otherwise lack. This fragile psychological armor sometimes made the difference between withering in fear or rallying to endure. Over generations, these practices became traditions. Small ceremonies before lighting new fires, chants muttered over blood spilled in the snow, taboos about which trees could be cut or which caves must be avoided at certain times. They carried forward even when the great glaciers began at last to retreat,
echoing down ages into festivals and folk beliefs whose meanings would be half forgotten, yet stubbornly repeated.
They were not the only hunters in their frozen world. For every careful step taken by a man with a spear or a woman gathering bitter roots beneath the frost, there were paws, broad, silent, padded, tracing those same trails. Eyes glowed in the half-light of dawn, nostrils flared to catch the thin scent of sweat and smoke drifting on the icy air. In the age of endless winter, humans were never the undisputed masters of the land. They were merely one more desperate species vying for survival in a theater crowded with formidable predators. The most dreadful of these rivals was the cave bear, a creature so immense that its shadow could swallow 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. These bears were not timid forest wanderers nosing for berries. They were mountains of muscle draped in thick fur, with jaws powerful enough to splinter femurs as easily as twigs. When they reared up, they loomed higher than any human could fathom, their deep, resonant growls vibrating through the very ground. A single blow from one massive paw could break a rib cage or tear a head clean from shoulders. It was no idle threat. Countless bones uncovered in caves millennia later still bear the deep gouges of their claws. Then there were the cats, the saber-toothed nightmares with elongated fangs that could punch through hide and sinew to slice life from the heart in a heartbeat. Unlike the more familiar big cats of today that often stalk prey with patience and caution, these predators were driven by the demands of enormous bodies and massive jaws that required steady feeding. Their wide muzzles, built to accommodate deadly teeth, meant they delivered gruesomely deep killing bites. To make matters worse, their low-slung, power-packed frames made them explosive ambush artists, capable of launching themselves from behind a drift or boulder with terrifying force. Dire wolves, too, haunted the same paths as humans. Larger than modern wolves, with heavier skulls and stronger jaws built for crushing bone, they roamed in packs that worked with chilling coordination. Once a human scent was picked up, the tang of sweat, the faint iron of blood from a small hunting cut, it could be shared among dozens of snouts, each beast understanding its role in a long, tireless pursuit. These wolves were endurance hunters, willing to follow for miles, wearing down even the strongest legs until the kill was easy. Against such enemies, what could humans do? They had no claws or fangs, no thick pelts or instinctive knowledge of the snowbound forests. But they possessed something rarer, the ability to learn, to adapt, to pass insights from mouth to ear so that each generation stood slightly less blind than the last. They observed keenly. Stories were told around fires of how a lone wanderer never returned, his blood found splashed across the snow, the prints of giant paws circling like a gruesome signature. Children grew up hearing these tales and took them not as horror for its own sake, but as hard instruction. Don't stray far alone. Stay downwind when traveling. Avoid game trails freshly marked with deep claw scratches or enormous droppings that steamed in the cold. They learned to watch the birds and small beasts, too, how they scattered or went silent when a large predator stalked nearby. Even dogs, those first tentative partners, still half wild and untrustworthy, served a new purpose. Their hackles and sudden growls gave precious seconds of warning when unseen killers drew close. Humans also changed how they moved through the world. They began to avoid traveling at dusk or dawn, when ambush hunters were most active.
Instead of long, exposed marches across open fields of snow, they stuck to rocky ridges or lines of stunted trees where quick cover was always near. When forced to camp in hostile territory, they didn't merely build a fire, they ringed it with obstacles, stacked deadwood or spiked branches in hasty barricades that might give even a bold predator pause. And they found power in numbers. A single human with a spear stood little chance against a saber-tooth or a bear in a foul mood. But 5 or 6 together, shouting, brandishing torches, hurling stones, that was a different story. Coordination became its own weapon. They practiced driving off encroaching beasts, not through brute strength, but through cunning shows of unity and nerve that made even apex predators reconsider a charge. Still, there were costs. Hunters disappeared, dragged off by jaws that left only a trail of blood. Camps were sometimes attacked outright, torn apart in the night by bears emerging from hibernation, too hungry to fear man's feeble fire. Every season brought new losses, fresh caution layered over old grief. In time, however, these countless hard lessons hardened into a shared memory, almost a sixth sense. Children grew up with a low, constant hum of vigilance thrumming through their bones. Every snap of a twig, every unnatural hush of birdsong set nerves on edge. This primal alertness was no accident of evolution. It was the direct inheritance of those countless cold nights when eyes peered into darkness and spotted just in time the slow, sinuous stalk of something that saw them not as rivals or fellow creatures, but simply as meat. Thus did humans learn not merely to survive alongside giants and monsters, but to exist in wary balance with them, each species adapting to the cunning and ferocity of the others. In this brutal dance, they developed sharper wits, stronger bonds with one another, a respect for caution that echoed through their very language. And while many would still fall, clawed down beneath ancient teeth in the shadowed snows, enough lived and learned to whisper those lessons into the ears of the next generation. That was how, step by trembling, determined step, they carved out a fragile right to exist in a world ruled by predators that even the fiercest winter could not tame. At first, it must have seemed like nothing more than an unsettling curiosity. Pale shapes moving just beyond the fire's comforting glow. Pairs of eyes reflecting the flames with a watchful, calculating light. In the beginning, these visitors were the same dire wolves that sometimes haunted the edges of human camps with less benign intent, sniffing hungrily for scraps, weighing the risks of slipping into the circle of warmth to snatch an unwary child or drag off a carcass. But slowly, so slowly that no single generation would have been able to point to the moment it began, something shifted. Not every wolf that slunk close came with murder on its mind. Some, gaunt with hunger, driven by the same relentless winter that starved human bellies, lingered at a distance, content to scavenge the refuse of hunts and fires. They learned that if they kept to the edges, if they didn't flash fangs or creep too near sleeping bodies, the strange upright creatures would not hurl spears or stones. And the humans, in turn, observed. They noticed which wolves merely watched, tails low, shoulders not bristling with aggression. In the icy dark, even such tenuous companionship meant something. These beasts became a sort of living alarm system. If wolves suddenly pricked their ears or slunk backward, hackles raised, it often signaled that something more dangerous, perhaps a bear or a saber-tooth, prowled nearby. There were accidents of fate, too. An orphaned pup might have been found weak and shivering near a kill site, small enough to tuck into a fur-lined sling by a tender-hearted woman or a curious child. Its playful snaps and clumsy paws amused the young, and its eventual barking scared off smaller predators. So little by little, a bond born of sheer chance and mutual desperation began to form. It was not simple or smooth. Many early attempts to draw these wolves closer surely ended in blood, with teeth sinking into reaching hands or fragile throats. But over countless seasons, the most daring, or perhaps the most desperate, of these animals discovered that there was real advantage in shadowing human camps. Here were bones with marrow still inside, skins and scraps discarded after meals, piles of offal left from butchering that meant a wolf did not have to gamble its life on chasing fleet-footed deer across snow that sapped every ounce of energy. Equally, humans who tolerated these rough companions found they gained more than they lost. A watchful half-wolf dozing near the edge of camp might snap to its feet and growl at the faintest scent of prowling cats. Its keener ears and nose offered an early warning system no human could match. Packs that gradually learned to follow human hunting parties found they benefited too, nipping at the heels of fleeing prey, driving it back toward waiting spears. Over generations, an invisible sorting took place. The wolves that were most aggressive, that lunged for throats or snatched food from a human's hand, were quickly killed or driven off. Those that were merely wary, content to skulk at the perimeter and wait patiently, survived and passed on their temperament. In this way, the first crude lines of selection were drawn, not through deliberate breeding, but by the hard logic of survival for both species. And so, through countless quiet, frost-bitten nights where hungry eyes met across dying fires, the first dogs emerged. They were not yet the sleek companions that would one day race beside sleds or doze at the foot of a modern bed. They were shaggy, rangy things, still half wild, prone to slipping away into the dark for days at a time. Yet they returned, drawn by something older than trust, a shared struggle against the same brutal cold, the same gnawing hunger. In time, humans began to rely on them, not just for warnings, but for help in the hunt itself. A pack of semi-tame dogs could circle prey, harry it, tire it, drive it back toward waiting hands. Their noses found burrows and hidden dens under snow that human senses would have overlooked completely. They even provided warmth. Families sometimes allowed these beasts to sleep at the edges of shelters, their bodies adding just enough heat to tip the scales between shivering through the night and waking up alive. But perhaps most remarkably, dogs offered something less tangible, yet just as vital: companionship. In a world ruled by ice and predators, where every day balanced on a knife's edge, the simple fact of another heartbeat near your own, another creature whose eyes met yours without immediate threat, must have carried a comfort beyond measure. It was a quiet reassurance that not everything in the dark wished them harm. Through these fragile, halting alliances, dogs quite literally helped humanity endure. They guarded children while adults ventured out to hunt. They reduced the toll taken by prowling beasts in the night. They stretched the reach of human ears and noses into the snow-laden wilderness. Without them, some argue, the small, scattered bands of people might have dwindled entirely, worn down by predators, outcompeted by colder-blooded rivals better suited to that merciless age. Thus was sealed one of the oldest and most profound pacts on Earth, between human and dog, two species that learned together to watch the horizon for creeping shadows, to huddle close when the cold became a living thing, to stand side by side against a world that cared nothing for their survival, and in doing so, they gave each other a chance neither might have seized alone. It's tempting to picture the people of the Ice Age as living solely on steaming strips of mammoth or marrow cracked from heavy bones, as if survival in that frozen world relied on nothing but blood, fat, and fire. But tucked into the darker corners of their shelters, woven into their most precious bundles, lay secrets that were just as crucial to keeping breath in their bodies through the long, bitter months: plants. Not lush fruits or bright vegetables, which the cold had banished to distant dreams, but humble roots, twisted stalks, knobby tubers, dried leaves and shriveled berries, a small, fragile arsenal against starvation and sickness. The knowledge of these plants was a quiet inheritance, passed down not with ceremony, but through countless casual moments. A grandmother's hand guiding a child's to dig in the right patch of soil, a mother's warning never to chew a certain leaf with the bitter milky sap. Over seasons and generations, this intimate relationship with the hidden life of the land became a second language, one spoken in stains on fingers and the subtle tug of the nose toward earth that promised more than snow. Even deep in winter, when the world seemed stripped bare, they found ways to coax sustenance from the frozen ground. Certain tubers, tough as knotted wood, could be dug out with patience. They required long, slow roasting by the fire to break down stubborn fibers, turning into something sweet and chewy that slipped warmth into hollow bellies. In the precious weeks before true thaw, these roots sometimes sprouted tiny new shoots underground, rich with stored energy, a secret harvest beneath the sleeping snows. There were also hardy evergreens, whose needles could be boiled into sharp, resinous teas that brought crucial vitamins. Without such brews, their gums might bleed, teeth loosen, joints ache from scurvy's creeping hand. But with them, even the smallest mouthful delivered a sting of life that kept bodies strong enough to see another moon pass. Pine bark itself, carefully stripped and scraped of its bitter outer layer, offered a spongy inner rind that could be dried and ground, stirred into stews to thicken them when meat ran low. And then there were the gathered herbs, the quiet lifeline stored against the cold. Through the warmer months, whole families ventured out with woven slings over their shoulders, picking leaves and flower heads, digging small roots and shaking dirt from them with practiced snaps. These gatherings were dried on flat stones in the sun, or suspended from the low ceilings of shelters, where smoke from daily fires wound through them, helping to preserve and even imbue them with a deeper potency. By the time winter's grip settled fully, most camps had a sort of crude pantry, small skin pouches hanging from the walls, woven baskets tucked into rocky crevices where stray sparks couldn't reach. In these lay their precious collections: curls of bark with medicinal saps, fragrant handfuls of dried leaves to brew into teas for fevers or stomach pains, berries so shriveled they seemed almost fossilized, but which could still be chewed to keep hunger from gnawing quite so fiercely. This was their pharmacy, their quiet testament to foresight and memory. A woman might reach without looking into a particular bag for a twist of dried mint to soothe a child's cough, or sprinkle ground root into a thin stew to help a man regain strength after a wound. Not all their uses of plants were purely physical. Certain herbs burned in the fire gave off smokes that were believed to chase away not just insects, but ill spirits that might lurk around the edges of the camp, waiting for a chance to slip inside the lungs of the weak. Shamans kept their own private bundles of plants, some with heady scents that, when crushed and inhaled, opened the mind to strange spiraling visions. Through these they claimed to walk alongside ancestors, to speak with the forces of winter and plead for mercy. The care taken with these small natural treasures was almost reverent. Children were taught from their earliest days which roots could be nibbled raw, which required careful boiling, which must never be touched at all. They watched wide-eyed as older hands tied bunches with sinew and hung them in smoke, learned the difference between a harmless fuzzy leaf and one that brought cramping agony. Mistakes were costly. Stories ran through families of children who had picked the wrong berry, whose lips turned blue, whose eyes rolled back before they could be saved. Such memories ensured each new generation listened closely. And so, in the hidden corners of their rough homes, beneath the massive skulls of hunted beasts, or tucked between stacks of firewood, lay these humble but essential stores of life. They might not have been as dramatic as the bloody haunches of meat dragged back from a successful hunt, but they were equally vital. Without them, the human body would slowly falter, robbed of the subtle nutrients it needed to keep heart steady and muscles ready for the next desperate chase. Through these simple gatherings, a pinch of leaf, a clutch of roots, a handful of pungent bark, these early people wove a quiet alliance with the stubborn life that still clung to the edges of their frozen world. It was a pact older and perhaps even more profound than their wary agreements with fire or stone. For in each small bundle of dried herbs lay not just calories or cure, but the distilled memory of sunlit meadows and green, whispering groves. Fragile promises that somewhere beyond the snow, life still pulsed, waiting for the chance to flood back in when winter finally lost its grip. When the dark settled in, and in that age, nightfall did not simply arrive, it descended like a vast living creature, pressing heavy on the shoulders and crawling cold along the ground. The small fires became more than just warmth. They were fragile islands of light in an ocean of ink, sanctuaries against all the silent things lurking beyond sight. Around these modest blazes, people huddled close, breath rising in soft plumes, faces half lit by amber glow, half lost in shadow. It was there, in that tenuous circle, that the true fabric of their hearts was revealed. Much of what they spoke about was the same as what fills quiet hours even today: practical concerns, the marrow of daily life. They discussed where tracks had been found in the snow, puzzling over which trails were freshest, which might lead to herds bedded down for the night. They made hushed plans about who would set snares at dawn, whose turn it was to keep the next watch. Voices sometimes dropped to low mutters as they weighed moving camp entirely, debating if the nearby stream would soon freeze over completely, or if the wind had shifted enough to make the cave's mouth more of a danger than a refuge. But such discussions, though vital, were always interlaced with something deeper. For when the tasks of immediate survival were accounted for, the silence beckoned. And in that silence, stories inevitably rose. These were not tales meant only to entertain, though laughter sometimes bloomed around the fire, sudden and bright as sparks leaping skyward. They were lifelines of memory and instruction, stitched with warnings and layered with the wisdom of countless seasons. Elders recounted how a foolish hunter once chased a wounded stag too far into a valley where the snow hid thin ice, never to be seen again. Or how, many winters past, two families tried to share a cave, only to fall into bitter feuding that ended with blood on the stone and spirits that still prowled the site, seeking repayment. There were older, darker legends too. Stories of great shadows that roamed the world when it was new, monstrous forms of ice and teeth that fed not on flesh, but on breath itself, squeezing lungs until the world went dim. Tales of wandering spirits with eyes like polished bone that slipped into camps at night, settling themselves by the fire to listen until someone made the mistake of meeting their gaze. Such stories made children burrow closer into mothers' sides, small fists clutching fur cloaks, while adults poked at the flames with deliberate care, as if stirring the embers could keep such visions at bay. Yet not all their nocturnal talk was draped in fear. Just as often, voices softened with hope. They spoke of distant springs, of valleys whispered about by travelers who claimed the snow there melted first, where streams ran freely and the trees kept their needles deep green all year. Sometimes young pairs, fingers intertwined, shared dreams of how many children they might have once the world grew kinder again. Plans for hunts to come, for new tools to carve, for better shelters. All these wove through the hours as surely as the smoke curled up to vanish among the icy stars. There was comfort, too, in simple repetition. Parents would trace old scars on their arms or legs, explaining again how each was earned. A near miss from a charging bison, a slice from a careless flint edge, a burn from grabbing a pot that slipped in the rush to save boiling fat. These humble narratives reminded everyone that danger was not always a predator with shining fangs. Sometimes it was the ordinary tasks of life that left the deepest marks. Children often prompted these retellings, their wide eyes shining with a blend of fear and fascination. "Tell how you escaped the bear again," they'd plead, and a father or mother would oblige, voice low and dramatic, until the final leap onto a rock or the desperate plunge into a stream had tiny mouths hanging open. Such stories were more than entertainment. They were lessons encoded in memory, guiding future choices, subtly shaping instincts that might one day save the listeners' own lives. As night deepened, voices often trailed into reflective murmurs. Someone might share a dream, strange, vivid fragments of chasing prey across endless plains, or of standing on ice so clear the stars shone up from beneath. Others would nod, pondering what such visions meant. Perhaps the ancestors sent them as warnings. Perhaps they were glimpses of worlds yet to be. Through all this, laughter rose and fell. Arguments, too, sometimes sharp as flint blades, flared and died. Tears were shed for loved ones lost to winter or beasts or simple cruel fate. Hands clasped other hands. Shoulders leaned together. In these fragile gatherings, humanity did more than merely pass the hours until dawn. They reinforced the invisible threads that bound them, wove courage into the quiet terror that every cold night brought. And when eventually someone's head would droop, words fading into the slow rhythm of sleep, the conversations did not truly end. They drifted on in half-heard whispers, in dreams that stitched together scraps of story and fear and longing. So the long winter nights passed, not as empty hours devoured by darkness, but as shared journeys of breath and voice. The first true tapestries of community, spun out beside small flames, that, for all their modest crackling, held back a vast and waiting night. It seems almost paradoxical. In a world gripped by merciless cold, where each dawn was uncertain and every breath a fragile wager against frost and hunger, one might expect all energy to be hoarded for the bare mechanics of survival. And yet, right there in the heart of the harshest millennia humanity had ever known, people began to decorate stone walls with breathtaking images, sweeping murals of running bison and rearing mammoths, delicate tracings of deer heads crowned with careful lines for antlers, even ghostly handprints pressed again and again into ochre-stained rock. Why? Why, at a time when it would seem every scrap of effort should be spent on building stronger shelters or tracking elusive prey, Did our ancestors gather pigments and devote precious hours to creating art deep in echoing caves? The answer reaches into the marrow of what it means to be human, and how desperately they needed something that transcended their brutal daily fight to stay alive. In part, it was surely an act of memory. Those paintings were records, yes, proud testaments that here they had walked, hunted, witnessed wonders. Images of game were more than decoration. They were reminders of creatures' shapes and movements, the way hooves struck the ground, the tilt of antlers when startled. They might have served as teaching tools, used by elders to show the young exactly how a herd might fan out across a valley, or what signs to watch for when stalking a wary stag. But if it were only about instruction, why the haunting grace of so many lines? Why the careful shading that made flanks ripple with implied motion, or the attention lavished on capturing the wild glint in an animal's eye? There was more at work here, something profoundly emotional, even spiritual. These paintings were a defiance of sorts, a way to say, the world may be vast and cruel, but we are here, and we see it, and we make it ours by remaking it on these walls. When people pressed their palms against wet pigment and left a rust-red handprint, they were doing more than marking a place. They were screaming into the silence, asserting existence against the immense blankness of ice and time. Imagine how those caves must have felt. Outside, winds tore across plains of snow, dark skies loomed heavy and close. But inside the dim, smoky hollows, figures sprang to life under the flickering light of torches. The animals seemed to run and leap, animated by shifting shadows. In those moments, perhaps the watchers felt less like shivering, desperate creatures on the edge of extinction, and more like participants in a shared dream, a world where the hunt always ended in triumph, where herds flowed endlessly, fat and plentiful, waiting to be claimed. Many believe these images were also bound up with magic. Not sleight-of-hand illusions, but the deep, primal belief that depicting an animal could grant power over it. To draw a mammoth might be to ensure the clan would find such beasts when next they ventured out. To paint a series of dark arrows striking its side was to invite success, to bend the uncertain forces of the world toward a favorable outcome. The walls became silent conspirators, repositories of hopes too large and fearful to speak outright. Beyond all of this was something simpler yet just as vital: the need to keep minds from fraying under the strain of relentless hardship. The endless repetition of hunting, scraping hides, tending fires, nursing half-frozen limbs, it wore at the spirit as surely as wind hollowed rock. Art was a reprieve. It was the chance to sit together in the hidden safety of the earth, to mix ochre with animal fat and carefully push color across stone. It demanded concentration, skill, even joy. Watching a form slowly take shape under your own hand was a small miracle, a spark of control in a life otherwise ruled by forces far beyond human reach. And so, ironically, it was precisely because the Ice Age was so merciless that art bloomed. It was their answer to despair, their medicine against the madness of endless cold and fear. In those painted walls, they built a refuge no storm could tear down. Each line was a quiet declaration: we endure, we remember, we dream. Long after their fires had gone cold and their bones lay buried under fresh cycles of frost and thaw, the images remained, vivid as the day they were made. Proof that even in humanity's most tenuous hour, when they could have been nothing more than clever beasts scrabbling for scraps, they chose instead to create beauty, to weave meaning from struggle, to whisper to each other through the dark, "We are more than this winter. We are makers of worlds."
In a world where every day was an open challenge thrown down by frost and hunger, where stepping out beyond the fragile glow of the campfire might mean never returning, the bonds between people took on a weight and urgency that modern hearts can scarcely imagine. Love, that tender weaving of two lives into one, was not a luxury of their harsh age, but a cornerstone of survival. It formed under duress, was tested by unrelenting cold, and often grew all the stronger for having been forged in such unforgiving fire. At its simplest, the pairing of man and woman was a practical necessity. Raising children in an environment that could snatch life away with a single ill-timed storm demanded more than solitary effort. An infant born in those times was impossibly fragile, a small flame threatened by every draft. It took not just a mother's constant vigilance, but a father's steady hand bringing in meat, defending the shelter, sharing the long hours of watching over a feverish child to ensure that tiny heart kept beating through the night. Alone, either might be overwhelmed. Together, they stood a chance. But beyond the raw arithmetic of survival, something softer still took root. In the long, dark hours, while the wind clawed at cracks in stone and hide, bodies pressed close for warmth. Breath mingled, hearts settled into a shared rhythm. Whispers passed back and forth, sometimes dreams of better hunts or stories of kin long gone, sometimes just small murmurs to push back the encroaching silence. In those moments, a profound tenderness bloomed, one that could not be reduced to mere strategy. Shared hardship acted as a strange, powerful cement. When two people hauled water together from a half-frozen stream, when they strained side by side to drag a kill back across snow, or held each other in breathless terror while unseen predators circled the camp, something deep and unspoken knit them together. They came to rely on each other not just for food or protection, but for the steady comfort of knowing that in a cruel, capricious world, at least one soul was steadfastly in their corner. Jealousies and possessiveness no doubt existed. It would be folly to pretend early people were saints. Fights over affection, over the promise of strong children, or simply over the solace of another body in winter's bite surely flared. But unlike in lands of plentiful food and easy days, where hearts might wander on a whim, their harsh reality demanded resolution. Grievances smoldered, but were often quenched by the collective understanding that every adult was desperately needed. Clans could not afford long-lasting rifts. In many groups, elders quietly mediated, reminding younger lovers of what was truly at stake. Once bonds formed, they tended to deepen into something profoundly committed. These were not fleeting romances kindled by idle time. Each was an investment of trust, of shared labor, of whispered promises to guard each other through every lethal season. They slept shoulder to shoulder under the same hides, learned the small wordless language of each other's moods, when silence was needed, when a comforting hand should reach out. Together they tended wounds, split the last precious scraps of dried meat, mourned for lost children or parents, and took fragile hope in each new life that entered their circle. Children born of these unions were not simply a matter of pride, but of collective triumph. Every baby who survived its first perilous winters was a living testament to that couple's combined strength and care. Small wonder that tales from this time often lingered on images of proud fathers lifting infants high, or of mothers singing low songs while partners stood watch at cave entrances, spear in hand, eyes scanning the gloom for any threat. Even beyond the personal, these tight pairs strengthened the entire community. Each strong bond anchored the larger web of the clan, stitching together families into dense networks of mutual obligation and affection. A man who loved his partner fiercely would stand that much firmer in defense of her kin. A woman who trusted her mate utterly would work herself to the bone to ensure her sisters and cousins ate alongside her own. Perhaps most telling is that amid all this, the cold, the danger, the constant scraping for sustenance, they still found time to adorn one another. Beads carved from bone or ivory were traded. Teeth from successful hunts polished and strung as humble love tokens. Even a carefully tanned strip of hide tied around a wrist carried unspoken weight. I am yours. You are mine. We face this together. In this way, love in the age of ice was more than emotion. It was a pact of mutual defense against a world that seemed determined to snuff out fragile human life. It was two voices that promised to echo together across howling winds, two bodies that would shield each other through the longest nights. And in this relentless crucible, those promises did not merely survive, they became some of the strongest threads in the tapestry of our shared humanity. At first, it was so subtle that no one dared believe it. A morning came when the breath that once steamed from their mouths in thick, ghostly plumes drifted only lightly before vanishing. Snow still lay heavy on the ground, but here and there it loosened into wet slush beneath their feet, filling old tracks with dark meltwater. The change was like a whisper, the faintest sigh of a world that had been holding its breath for too long.
For generations, life had bent entirely around the cold. Hunters knew by instinct the best places to ambush reindeer migrating over frozen plains. Families pitched their shelters always with an eye to how winds swept off distant glaciers, packing down hides and snow against bitter gusts that never seemed to rest. Every tool, every song, every story they passed to their children was a blueprint for enduring endless winter. Then, almost imperceptibly, the rules began to shift. The first undeniable sign came in the rivers. Icy chains that had locked them silent for months began to groan, then shatter. Sheets of crystalline blue cracked and buckled, riding on roiling water beneath. When the ice finally broke, it did so with a force that was almost violent, sending shards tumbling downstream in great collisions that filled the air with deep, echoing booms. It was terrifying, but also thrilling. Children stood on muddy banks laughing, pointing at logs freed from long prisons of ice, while elders watched with narrowed eyes, weighing the promise of this thaw against hard memories of winters that had returned with a vengeance. As seasons cycled, the evidence grew harder to ignore. Grasses poked tentative green blades through damp earth where for so long only frost had lain. Herds of reindeer and wild horses, which once clustered in tight migratory lines across white expanses, began to fan out over broader pastures, finding more to graze. Even mammoths, massive creatures so long adapted to plowing through drifts with shaggy shoulders, seemed less numerous, struggling to adjust as their favored tundras gave way to softer, marshier land. Some wandered into valleys that offered more grass, but also more mud, places where their heavy feet sometimes sank, trapping them fatally. Scattered bones left to bleach in the new sun marked the slow beginning of their decline. Humans, too, began to shift. The same people who had learned to read the winds by how they funneled through snow-carved ravines now found themselves standing uncertain on damp ground. The skills that once meant life or death how to bundle furs, how to build snow shelters tight against blizzards, how to follow mammoths across frozen rivers, were still honored, but felt less urgently vital. Instead, new possibilities unfolded. As ice retreated, forests crept forward like cautious armies. Birch and pine spread into what had been wastelands of white. With them came animals that had been rare in the deepest cold: boar rooting through underbrush, sleek deer slipping between young trunks, birds returning in chattering flocks. People adjusted their hunts, learned fresh tracks, developed different traps. The old massive spears tipped for mammoth hides were gradually joined by lighter darts and snares better suited to smaller, quicker game. Their shelters changed, too. Where once they clustered tightly in caves or beneath low, insulating mounds of earth and hide, they began experimenting with lighter constructions, even building more open dwellings among the trees where breezes could stir smoke and keep biting insects at bay. In some places, as food grew a little easier to find, groups settled for longer stretches on promising patches of land, giving rise to something like seasonal camps. Here, children ran more freely, no longer so tightly bound to the necessity of huddling close for warmth. Fires still burned, always, but now they crackled under broader skies, sometimes even under stars without heavy canopies of hide and snow above. Yet this transition was not entirely gentle. The retreating ice carved new rivers and left behind lakes that drowned old familiar paths. Floods swept through lowland routes, altering the lay of the land so completely that elders who had led the way their entire lives sometimes stood baffled. Stories that had anchored communities, where to find herds at certain moons, how winds would shift in certain valleys, grew less reliable, prompting a quiet anxiety. Their world was becoming both richer and stranger. And for the mammoths, it was a slow tragedy. As forests encroached, their wide, tundra-adapted teeth wore down on softer, more fibrous plant matter they were ill-equipped to process. Their calves found less of the hardy Ice Age grasses they'd once thrived on. Human hunters, already masters at working together to take down these giants, continued to pursue them, partly by tradition and partly by sheer need. Each mammoth killed was still a trove of meat, hide, bone, but fewer and fewer of the great beasts remained to replenish the herds. Before long, their silhouettes became rarer on the horizon, and camps that had once sung victory songs over mammoth kills began to mark such hunts as almost legendary feats. Through it all, people proved astonishingly adaptable. Just as their ancestors had once learned to survive crushing cold, so now they learned to navigate a world unfurling again into warmth and growth. Old alliances and rivalries shifted. New plants were tested for edibility. New animals cautiously hunted. Around fires that still burned against lingering chill, elders wove new lessons into old tales, helping the next generation see not just the dangers of the thaw, but its gifts. It was a dramatic, uneasy transformation, an entire way of life shaped by ice, slowly yielding to a different rhythm. But in this fragile change, humanity glimpsed a future beyond endless winter, a world where perhaps survival would demand not thicker hides and sharper spears alone, but new crafts, new customs, new dreams. And so, with cautious hope, they stepped forward across ground softening at last under the hesitant return of the sun. The final winters of that long, merciless epoch did not vanish all at once, like mist burned off by a sudden sun. They lingered instead, reluctant phantoms clinging to valleys and shadowed hillsides, reluctant to cede a world they had ruled for so many thousands of years. For generations, people lived through these drawn-out farewells of the ice, never fully trusting that the cold would not simply rally and seize the earth again. By then, the old life, the life defined entirely by the tyranny of frost, was already slowly dissolving. Settlements that had once hugged the mouths of caves or clustered around carefully chosen stone outcrops began to spread outward. People ventured beyond the tight confines of shelters that had been built to endure blizzards, experimenting with more open constructions, letting the forest edge creep nearer to their hearths. Some bands, emboldened by longer seasons of gentler weather, returned year after year to the same spots, learning the cycles of new plants and animals that moved in where glaciers had once scraped the earth bare. Still, the winters could bite with sudden ferocity. A year might pass with mild signs, flowers persisting into late autumn, herds lingering in upland meadows far longer than their ancestors ever dared, only to be followed by a savage return of storms that buried the hopeful green under heavy drifts. These last great winters were treacherous precisely because they were no longer constant. They came and went unpredictably, forcing families to keep both old and new ways close at hand.
In these decades, the people were hybrids of their own histories. Grandmothers still taught children to stitch heavy layered cloaks from pelts, to wrap their feet in thick moss-lined boots, just as their own mothers had done. Old spear designs, honed for plunging deep into massive hides, were still carefully maintained. Stories of mammoths, of entire clans working in orchestrated dance to drive a giant bull into traps, were recited as proudly as ever, even though, by then, the great beasts themselves were dwindling to near myth. Some young people could scarcely remember the last time they'd seen such colossal forms lumbering across snowy plains. At the same time, the people embraced new resources with cautious wonder. Where once they had relied almost exclusively on herds that roamed open tundra, they began to stock smaller, quicker animals that thrived in budding woodlands. Red deer, boar, even hares that hid among thickets too dense for easy pursuit. Their shelters grew to reflect these mixed demands. Some still built low, half buried against unexpected blasts of snow. Others raised more lightly, with wood frames and bark that could be quickly repaired or expanded when warm months proved long and fruitful. Social patterns also began to shift. In the harshest centuries of the ice, life often demanded that families cluster into tight, mutually dependent groups where every adult had a clear role and every mouth meant a dangerous addition in lean times. With the coming of milder years, people began to gather in slightly larger seasonal encampments, drawn by rivers teeming with fish during certain months or by patches of ground newly rich with edible plants. Such gatherings allowed for exchanges of goods, for songs to spread far beyond a single bloodline, for stories to flourish and change, stitching together broader networks of kinship and memory. Yet despite these signs of a world in transition, the ghosts of the ice remained everywhere. Even in waning power, the cold still killed. A sudden late freeze could wipe out the tender new growth people had only just learned to rely on. An unexpected blizzard might trap families in shelters poorly designed for such fury, forcing them back into desperate lessons their ancestors had long mastered. And always there was a lingering reverence, or perhaps fear, of the forces that had once held the entire earth in a white grip. Shamans still performed rites to honor spirits of frost and wind. Offerings were still laid at the bases of ancient standing stones, just in case the winter decided to test humanity's humility once more. Culturally, this was a time of bittersweet layering.
The old songs that spoke of endless snows and hunts for towering beasts, mixed with new chants celebrating rivers breaking free and meadows blooming. Cave walls that once depicted only the proud silhouettes of mammoths and woolly rhinos began to feature more varied creatures, lithe deer, birds in flight, even tentative renderings of plants unfurling leaves. It was as if the art itself mirrored the gradual awakening of the land, a hesitant reaching toward the promise of a softer age. And so, through these last stubborn winters, humanity stood balanced between two worlds. They carried in their bones and blood all the fierce resilience that endless cold had demanded, a legacy of unity, cunning, and relentless endurance. But they also began to dream differently. Fires built not only for sheer survival now lit gatherings where laughter lasted deep into the night. Children played outside shelters with less dread of sudden storms swallowing them whole. In this delicate span of time, the people were both the last true children of the ice and the first pioneers of a reborn Earth. They honored the old ways because they had to, because forgetting was dangerous. Yet they also looked ahead with cautious hope, sensing perhaps that this long, grinding chapter of ice was finally drawing to a close. Even if they could not yet trust it fully, they began, tentatively, stubbornly, joyously, to live as if the world might soon belong to green things again. Long after the last great sheets of ice had retreated into distant mountain folds, after mammoths had become only strange shapes carved into bone pendants or painted onto walls gone soot-black with age, the memory of the vast cold still breathed in the hearts of those who had once lived beneath its rule. It settled not only in the marrow of their bodies, which still grew thick hair to guard against chill and burned with a metabolism honed by lean times, but also in the fragile, enduring architecture of their minds. Parents who had grown up in the tail end of the long winter carried with them stories that were heavy with warning. Around fires that now burned more for comfort than sheer necessity, they told children of nights when the air would slice the inside of the nose raw, when breath froze in beards so quickly it left hoarfrost that had to be chipped away before it clogged the mouth. They spoke of wandering across white plains under skies so leaden it felt as if the very heavens would fall and crush them, of listening to the ice groan and shift beneath their feet, never knowing if it might suddenly crack and swallow them whole.
These stories were not mere indulgences in fear. They were living lessons, encoded in narrative, because narrative was what the mind remembered best. They passed along practical wisdom disguised as drama. How to find the best shelter when the winds rose without warning. Why it was never wise to trust a seemingly solid stretch of ice. How one should always watch the animals, for when even the wolves and deer grew restless, it meant the cold might be about to turn savage again. But these tales also reached beyond instruction into the deeper currents of myth. Over generations, as the immediacy of the ice faded, stories began to shape the cold into something almost personified. The winter became not just a season, but a being, vast, implacable, with eyes like distant stars and breath that could still a heart in a moment. Parents painted it with terrifying poetry because they needed their children to understand that what they themselves had endured was not simply weather, but a force of nature that could return at any time. And deep down, perhaps they also still feared it themselves. Even as the land slowly healed, putting on new coats of green, people built caution into their celebrations. They marked the first snows of each year with wary offerings, a few berries laid upon stones, a strip of meat left outside the camp's edge. Songs that had once begged the ice to spare their children turned into ritual chants sung at winter festivals, keeping alive the idea that frost was not entirely tamed. In these traditions was woven a subtle, trembling respect for the cold that had once nearly claimed them all. Archaeologists would later unearth tiny figurines carved from antler and mammoth ivory long after the last mammoth had vanished, their surfaces polished smooth by countless hands. Some depicted people bundled in furs, holding each other close, eyes lifted as if searching for signs in the sky. Others showed great beasts locked in what seemed to be frozen motion, reminders perhaps of prey that once sustained them, but also of a world that demanded constant vigilance. Even more telling were the great communal stories that survived countless retellings, twisting with each new tongue, but always returning to the same haunting motifs. A long night that seemed it might never end, hunting grounds swallowed by white, children lost in drifts deeper than a man was tall, families clustered together with only the thin promise of a sputtering fire between them and a death as silent as it was certain. Through these tales, the cold became an ancestral echo, a shiver that danced along the spine of memory, whether or not the current winter was mild. In this way, the myth of the Great Winter became both a tether to the past and a quiet insurance policy. Because even in lush new times, when herds grazed freely and berries weighted branches almost to breaking, the stories of the ice lived on. They reminded people that the world could change again, that what had once been could return. It kept them vigilant, cautious, reluctant to waste or grow arrogant in plenty. Thousands of years would pass. Empires would rise and fall. Stone cities would sprawl across lands that had once been under glaciers. Yet people would still gather by hearths in the dark months, telling stories of an age when the cold was a living predator. In the deep hush of midwinter, as snow fell softly on roofs and the wind found cracks in shuttered windows, there would remain that small inherited tremor, a flicker of dread not entirely explainable. A collective memory whispered down bloodlines that remembered for them, reminding each generation anew. Once, long ago, the world was almost lost to the cold, and it might one day try to take them again. It's easy to imagine them as impossibly distant, those rag-wrapped figures crouched around smoky fires in low caves, faces half-painted with ochre, eyes wide to every whisper of the dark. We see their world as foreign beyond measure, a time ruled by teeth and claw and an endless, punishing cold. But if we stop and listen carefully, we find that they are not so far from us at all. Their breath still lingers in ours. Their fears and small triumphs beat quietly in our own chests. We are their long echo, living out futures they could never have dreamed, yet carrying pieces of them in ways more profound than we often recognize. Why else do we still draw such primal comfort from pulling on a heavy coat, feeling its padded weight settle around our shoulders as if to say, "You are safe, the cold will not take you tonight"? Somewhere deep in our bones, where old memories still hum like distant songs, we remember what it was to huddle together under hides, counting heartbeats while snow lashed the world outside. The simple ritual of wrapping up against chill is more than habit. It's the ghost of survival instincts honed over unthinkable ages, when warmth was the dividing line between life and slow, silent loss. Why else do we still gather so instinctively around flames? Whether it's a campfire crackling beneath the stars, a fireplace dancing in a winter room, or even the tiny glow of a candle when the lights go out, we draw close to that gentle, living light.
We stare into it, mesmerized, sharing stories, secrets, laughter. In those moments, we are no different than our ancestors sitting on stone floors, leaning close to catch sparks on their skin, spinning tales that were half warning, half hope. Fire was once our only promise against the dark, our fragile barricade against things with gleaming eyes just beyond the ring of light. That bond has never truly loosened. Why, too, do we continue to tell stories when the night grows long? Tales whispered by lamplight, scary legends shared under blankets, epic movies watched in darkened rooms, all of them threads pulled straight from that first tapestry woven by trembling voices in the ice. Those ancient people discovered that stories could soothe the racing heart, teach a lesson sharper than any spear point, knit a group together so that no one felt quite so alone. We've changed the language, swapped pelt-lined caves for plush living rooms, but we still crave that communion, still pass wisdom and wonder from mouth to ear, because it roots us to each other, and to something older than any city. And so the truth emerges. We are not standing on the far side of some vast canyon, gazing back at brutish ancestors we have outgrown. We walk a bridge they began building with every careful breath in the cold, every handprint pressed in ochre on stone, every time they clutched each other close and whispered, "Hold on, just one more night." That bridge stretches unbroken through time, from their shivering silhouettes to our own shadowed reflections. Inside each of us still stirs that same cautious hope they once carried, the determination to survive, to protect our children, to find warmth, to push back against the great indifferent dark, with laughter, stories, small shared joys. We keep their memory not just in museums or books, but in the pulse of our daily lives. When we light a candle against gloom, pull a blanket around a loved one, or simply pause to watch snowfall with a quiet, awed heart, we honor them. We echo them. And perhaps that is the most profound inheritance of all. Not just that they endured so we might be here, but that in countless quiet ways they still walk beside us. In every cautious step onto icy streets, in every comfort we take from gathering close when winds howl, in every fire we build against the night, the oldest parts of us whisper the same ancient promise: together we will see the dawn.